Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Nimzo Indian defense, and it's about the move for Queen c2. And this move is actually the main move in the Nimzo Indian defense. It's called the classical variation, and it's played perhaps most of the time when it's compared to other moves in the Nimzo Indian defense. So let's see how it goes. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and now bishop to b4. You just go queen c2 now. And after queen c2, the move knight c6 is played. Attacking the d4 pawn, and this is actually considered the Zurich variation of the classical. So knight to f3, d6, bishop to d2 is one move here. And a couple of other moves we can look at are bishop to g5, e4, and also a3. And we're first actually going to be looking at the move bishop to g5 because it's the biggest sideline. After bishop to g5, you just have to remember to play h6 and kick the bishop back. The bishop will now go back to d2, for instance, and you castle. And your main objective is to mainly play the move e5. And you'll see that this is the very common theme that happens throughout the entire opening theory. So that was bishop g5, and the next move we're going to be looking at is e4. And e4 tries to do the thing that you always want to do in the Nimzo Indian defense, and that is to get the pawn trio in the center. Now black will play the move e5, and what black wants to do is essentially get weaknesses around the pawn trio structure. And after e5 is played, you have a choice as white. Do you want to play de5, or do you want to play d5? And most of the time your opponent will actually just play d5, and it's a very simple idea. You want to just simply grab some more space in the center. And here, what must you do here as black? You must play the move bishop takes c3 check. Now, why must you play this move? Well, let's say that you bring this knight back to e7. The problem with a move like this is that there's queen a4 check. And after this check, you're attacking the bishop, and you can't really protect it with the move knight c6, as your knight would be hanging due to the pawn being able to capture it. So you would have to give up a piece either with knight c6, and after dc6 you would have to capture the knight on c3, and then perhaps take the pawn on c6, or something else which would just give you a worse position. Bishop c3, on the other hand, is a very good move. You do give up your bishop pair, but in the Nimzo Indian, this is just how it works. You have to give up your bishop pair in order to get very good control of the center. The knight goes back to e7. Note that you cannot capture the pawn on e4 because there's queen c2. Now, your knight on e4 is attacked, and so is your knight on c6. And unfortunately, you cannot defend both of them at the same time, so you're going to have to give one of them up. So that's why you don't take the pawn on e4, and you play knight e7. Now you are threatening to take the pawn on e4. So white will obviously defend, and you will castle, and white will castle as well, and now you go knight to h5. The simple idea being to try executing the move knight to f4 immediately, or you could just bring this knight into g6, and build up the pressure a bit more, and then only bring the knight into f4. It's the same idea, but it's just a bit more reinforced. So that was the move e4, and now we're going to be looking at a3. And after a3 is played, you just take the knight on c3. The queen will take the bishop. The move a5 is played, and a5 is played with the idea of basically telling white that if you try to go for b4 now, then I can just take, and if you take back, I can just take the rook, and after queen takes a1, there is now knight takes b4. Unfortunately for white as well, you cannot go queen to a4 check because there's knight c6. You block the check, and now you can't go d5 because there's ed, cd, and now knight takes d5. And here, if you try to check again, trying to find a way to fork the king and the knight, then just bishop to e6 is fine. Even bringing this knight back to e7 is fine. Black can castle quite easily, and there's no problem in the position whatsoever. So b4 doesn't work. Instead, the move b3 was played. Now castled kingside, bishop to b2, building a battery along the diagonal. Rook to e8 is played, g3. So now white wants to fianchetto the bishop. e5, de5, de5, bishop g2, bishop g4, castles, and now bishop takes f3. This is played with the idea of trying to bring the knight on c6 into d4. So bishop f3 will be played here, and now black brings the knight into d4. And you cannot take the pawn on b7, because the pawn on e2 is hanging, and then the queen would be captured next. So bishop b7 doesn't work. Instead, rook fe1, defending the e2 pawn. Note that pinning the knight to the queen doesn't exactly work, because black could just take the bishop on f3 and then move the queen somewhere. So rook fe1 and c5. Black is not going to take the bishop though. Only when the rook goes to d1 will black take the bishop, but otherwise black is just going to play a composition like this. After c5, the queen could go to b6, attack the b3 pawn, and still you cannot play the move bishop b7 now, because there's rook to b8. And even though the pawn on e2 is defended, the pawn on b3 isn't. And after something like bishop to g2, there's simply rook takes b3. And that's it. After something like queen c1, black is very, very good in this position. And after something like queen d6, maybe queen b8 even, black has a very significant advantage. And black has no problems in converting this position here on out. So that's why the move bishop b7 doesn't work. So after c5, you should most likely try to find a way to force black to trade this knight off for the bishop, mainly like rook 8 to d1. So that is the end of the move a3. And we're going to be looking at our final sixth move, which is bishop to d2. After bishop to d2, black will castle, white will now play a3, and the idea usually follows a similar pattern. You want to play a3, kick the bishop back, or at least trade it for the knight on c3, in which you get to keep the bishop pair, and in this particular case, you don't even have to damage your pawn structure, which is a good thing for white. So bishop c3, and now queen to e7. So what does black try to do? Well, black wants to play the move e5 and get some space in the center. And with e5, not only would you be occupying a lot of space, but you would also want to be playing moves like developing the bishop out, say, to g4. And black would have a very nice position because the development can happen quite freely. So e4, and this is one move. The other few moves are b4, which try to strike on the queen side. e3, a passive move, which tries to do the same thing as e4, but it doesn't get as much central control. It also tries to reinforce the d4 pawn. And finally, the move g3, which just tries to fianchetto the bishop. And this is also completely fine. We're first going to be looking at the move g3, and after the g3 move is played, black goes e5, for the plan that they were originally intending. The pawn will now go to d5, and the black knight will go to b8. Bishop goes to g2, and now the knight comes back to e8. So both the knights are passive on the 8th rank, and the only piece that's really developed is the queen. But why exactly does black want to do this? Well, black wants to get the f5 movement. Even e4 is a possibility. And after e4, f5, black gets a secure position, and the pawns very nicely in the center. And although white could try to break the position up, it could give black a very significant pawn wedge or pawn nail in the position, and it's going to be a very hard job getting that out. So g3 is possible, but it would just result in a very strong pawn attack from black. And the other options are b4, which we're going to be looking at now, and after b4, e5 will be played. Same idea. d5, knight to b8, and now e4. White tries to get some more space control, and black will go knight h5, with ideas of f5, but also just to play the knight into f4, and those are both very powerful moves. Other than b4 and also g3, there's also the option of playing the move e3. And if e3 is played, a5, you strike from the side, and you prevent the move b4, because if b4 is now played, then there's a takes b4. And after a takes b4 is played, you might be thinking that there's no way to actually win anything, but there actually is, because you can just play rook takes a1 check, and after bishop takes a1, knight takes b4, and you win a pawn. The other option is to just go for the move knight takes b4, which wins a pawn directly. And if you play, let's say, the move queen to c1, then black can just take on a1, and after bishop takes a1, just bring the knight back, and black is simply up a pawn with no problem whatsoever. So b4 cannot really be achieved in this position after the move a5 is played. So after a5, you have two choices as white. You can either go b3 or bishop to d3, and we're first going to be looking at b3. If b3 is played, then there's e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, and after bishop e2, bishop g4, developing the bishop out. And the plan is pretty simple. You want to either take the knight on f3 with your bishop, give up that bishop, but you have very powerful knights. And you also want to basically occupy the d file because it'll be very powerful later on in the position. And, well, you would just have lots of control of white's territory. So that's why you could also choose bishop to d3, which would result in e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, and now you have two choices as white, either castles or knight g5. And if knight g5, then h6, knight e4, as the pawn on h7 was being threatened, and after knight e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. There's a very interesting tactical move that I would like you to try finding. The move is knight to d4, and the idea is that if you play either e takes d4 or bishop takes d4, you're in for a surprise. Because if you play e takes d4, then there's e takes d4, and after bishop takes d4, there's f5. And you're basically not going to be able to defend the bishop from the pawn. And you would have to castle, for instance, or play f3, and after, say, f takes e4, black is better. And if you play f3, it doesn't really change that fact, because after f takes e4, let's say now queen takes e4, black can just take the queen on e4, and after f takes e4, just go rook f4. Rook e8 doesn't work because e5 is there, but rook f4, and black's fine. You can just win the pawn back, and white has nothing to really do to stop any of this. So in either case, you would just be losing material after this. So knight d4, and you have a good position as black. So knight g5 is one move, but if you go for castles instead, then there's rook to e8, the bishop goes to f5. Note that you cannot fork the bishop on d3 and the knight on f3 with the move e4, because there's bishop takes f6, and after queen takes f6, the bishop will now just capture on e4, and you lost the pawn. And with the rook to e8, that move is now being prepared, because if you now play something like rook c1, then there's e4. And this actually does work this time, because if you play bishop f6, then black can just take with the pawn, and you're either losing this knight on f3 or the bishop on d3, and in either case, black is pretty much winning in this case. So that's why after this move, rook to e8, you have to be aware of what's going to happen. So here, after rook to e8 is played, bishop to f5. And after bishop to f5, the move bishop takes f5 is going to be played. Bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, the move queen e6. Black wants to trade the queens off and then get some attack towards maybe c4, or just activate the rook somehow. In either case, this is a fine position for black to play. And the final position we're going to be looking at is, instead of all of those other options, why not play the move e4? If e4 is played, then black goes e5, and now d5. Knight goes back to b8, bishop comes to e2, and now knight comes to h5. And here you might be thinking, this is a big mistake, because after this knight h5 move, knight takes e5. And now the knight is hit from the bishop on e2, and you cannot capture the knight with the queen because the bishop on c3 is defending the knight. But black has a very nice trick that actually will just win the pawn back, and I encourage you to try finding it out. Okay, so knight to f6, moving the knight back, and if you play the move knight anywhere, then just knight takes e4. And in this case it's knight f3, and after knight e4, castles, knight takes c3. Queen takes c3, and here the move bishop g4 is going to be played. Note that you shouldn't play the move queen takes e2 here, because either rook ae1 or rook fe1. In either case, this queen gets trapped, and you would just have to give it up for lots of material with something like queen e8, and now this is just going to be a win for white. So after bishop to g4, that is the end of the variation. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.